Good afternoon and namaste, everybody. Welcome to the first ever international conference by Indic Researchers Forum. Indic Researchers Forum is an independent research organization that researches on geopolitics, national security, culture, history, and social sciences through a civilizational perspective. The idea is to promote research and propagate the notion that the country has a civilizational heritage that is much larger and older than its recent history. Today's conference is on Fall of Kabul, recalibrating the security challenges. I am Sneha Kathy Sebastian, your host for the session. Currently, I'm a research associate for the forum. In today's conference, we will talk about various topics like the threat to international peace and security in today's web of international contacts, on how the Pashtun belt in Pakistan was transformed into an experiment for radical political Islam that led to severe human and civil rights violation of the Pashtun population, which this in turn gave rise to the civil rights movement called the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement in Pakistan. We will also look into the future of narcotics terrorism and terrorist groups like ISIS, Al Qaeda, and Taliban. We will also see the role of countries like US and China in the Afghan crisis, the future of Islamic fundamentalism, and how the Taliban will rule and affect the socio-political structure of Afghanistan. Now, we have an inaugural address by Major General Dr. Rajan Kochhar sir, recipient of Vashishtha Seva Medal. He's also the Advisory Council member of Indic Researchers Forum. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sneha. Uh, Grateful to Indic Research Forum for giving me this opportunity to deliver the inaugural address of this very important discussion today on Afghanistan and the ramifications for the security environment. Uh, Today, the topic becomes extremely relevant because of the current geopolitical situation which is prevailing in this region of South Asia. And most of the countries which are part of this region are seriously impacted by what is happening in Afghanistan. The concept note, I am sure all of us have gone through it, is extremely relevant when it talks of a realistic possibility of Pashtunwali ideology. The very idea of Pashtunistan is slowly gaining ground in Afghanistan and adjoining Pakistan. It will encompass uh, Peshawar and Quetta regions of Pakistan, and we are all aware that almost 47% of the population in Afghanistan are Pashtuns. The topic which says a fall of Kabul is takes me back to the Mughal era. If you remember, the forts in those times used to be fortified and protected. Therefore, it is quite surprising that in Afghanistan, Kabul was allowed to fall within hours, if not days. Uh, in the army, there is a concept of warfare which is known as protection of a node. It is a part of desert warfare teaching to us, and it is taught in most armies of the world. In the protection of the node, we have something known as advanced elements, which actually move out, and the entire surveillance and early warning systems are in place Therefore, it was quite surprising that Kabul fell without any preparation from either the United States or the Afghan army. And the technology and the resources which were available to the Afghan army in terms of drone, artillery, and air power were not utilized at all. And Taliban, which had none of these resources with them, were able to get into Kabul without any difficulty. The geostrategic landscape today, as it appears to me, we have a Paktiya Afghanistan, a hybrid Pakistan, an authoritarian China, and it's a very serious geostrategic challenge to India as well as to the rest of the world. Our vulnerability is our Jammu and Kashmir, because this new kind of axis which is emerging, it can be coined as the APC axis, Afghanistan, Pakistan, China axis. And this axis is gaining a strong hold as time goes by in Afghanistan. It's a reality. And this reality is slowly dawning on all of us, including the Central Asian republics. Russia is going to be vulnerable. Iran is going to be vulnerable. And that is why statements emanating from Iran, from Russia, from India have a commonality. Today, our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, is in the United States. He has met the Vice President and the President. And the kind of statements which are emanating now from United States makes it extremely relevant and apparent to all of us that how much concerned are we seeing the developments in Afghanistan in the last 1 month. Because what we have seen, this Taliban 2.0 is no different than Taliban 1.0. There is a deprivation of women. There is victimization carrying on. People are being executed. Journalists are not being spared. So where are we heading? And today, I'm glad this forum is going to discuss all these issues. The second most important aspect is that Pakistan and Afghanistan have a porous border, 2,600 kilometers of border, and the Durand line is not recognized by Afghanistan for obvious reasons. Pakistan is interested to do the fencing on this line, and Pakistan has already started the work. So, what happens with Taliban coming into power? Pakistan gets strategic depth, Afghanistan gets sustenance, and China gets the opportunity to expand right up to the Central Asian republics. The ambitious project of China, CPEC, we are all aware, is vulnerable in case Afghanistan is hostile. This CPEC runs right from Kashigar in China to the Gwadar port, and it is a 3,300 kilometer communication route, and it goes via the Karakoram highway, which is right next door to Afghanistan. So the vulnerability of this area, and therefore China would like to gain a foothold in Afghanistan. Today, Afghanistan has a lot of issues. It is mired in poverty, and today's newspaper report also spells out a COVID outbreak, because the healthcare system is not functional there. Most of the hospitals are non-functional, and the threat of COVID is still looming large all over the world. These the sustenance here, as we will be also discussing narco terrorism, 93% of the opium of the world is grown in Afghanistan. And you would be aware that $30 billion worth of heroin passes through Pakistan. And the margin of the ISI, who is monitoring this entire activity, is 90%. It is almost 3 times the budget of Pakistan. So you can understand why ISI is interested to have a stooge government or a proxy government in Afghanistan, because the entire drug trade, the narco trade, which is running into billions of dollars, is going to be impacted. Coming to the Pashtunistan movement and the PTM, as well as the Tehreek-e-Taliban in Pakistan, these are the portents which will cause a shift in the situation if handled properly. So these aspects, I am also sure, will get highlighted today in this August gathering of thinkers who would be discussing these issues very, very minutely. And in the last, the threat of caliphate radicalization is looming large, and especially for the whole world to take note of, because unless we control terrorism on Afghanistan soil, we are going to find the entire world into caliphate radicalization. And a small portion of it is already started in India in a few of the states. And our intelligence agencies are aware of it and are doing their best to contain it. So these are very relevant issues which I must compliment the young team of this forum of ours in taking it forward, especially at a global level. I thank all of us here who are here today, and wish you the very best in your deliberations. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir, for such an insightful start to our conference. In this session, we will talk about Taliban and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. I extend a very warm welcome to the session chair, Professor John Nomikos, who is the director at the Research Institute for European and American Studies. He is also the International Advisory Council member of Indic Researchers Forum. I also welcome the speakers, Dr. Dheeraj, Assistant Professor at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Dr. Nanda Kishore, Associate Professor and Head, Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, and Professor Christine Conard, Professor of International Security at Dublin City University. We are delighted to have all of you in our midst today. I now pass on the mic to Professor John Nomikos. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Neha Kathy Sebastian. I have to welcome all of you from Athens, Greece. And I have to say, to admit, this is an excellent, agenda, very impressive speakers. So I'm very happy, to be the chair of this distinguished panel. Now, as a chair, I'm not going to say too much. My mission is just to, to address, to my distinguished speaker. As you know, our agenda is quite, long, so the time is very valuable. And I'm sure Ms. Yasia Aria and the Executive Council of the Research Forum would appreciate that to have everything, under the agenda and under control. You know about the subject today in my session is Taliban and rise of Islamic fundamentalism. The only thing I would like to say to you that there is some members of the Haqqani network in the today's, Afghan government which is I just doubt how successful is going to be, the Afghan government to a new step forward that they would like to present it. But anyway, I stop here, and I would like, to invite our distinguished, first speaker, Dr. Dheeraj, if I spell right, sorry if I did not, Dr. Dheeraj, he's an assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, the so-called MAHE. He holds a PhD in intelligence studies from the University of Leicester, which is in the United Kingdom, and his research focuses on the role and dimension of intelligence and counterintelligence and national security policy making. And his speech that he's going to focus today is Afghan Jihad and the historical rise of Taliban. Distinguished speaker, Dr. Dheeraj, please, the floor is yours.
So, good afternoon to one and all, and thank you, Indic Researchers Forum. I congratulate you on organizing this seminar conference at the first instance, and also to thank Professor John Nomikos for chairing this session. Now, the topic that I'm supposed to talk on is Afghan Jihad and the historic rise of Taliban. Now, this very topic, having a very historical flavor, is supposed to sort of guide us to understand the present. And so I believe that it is important to look at the past in a manner that it helps us develop a framework that can then help us understand the present developments. So as the title itself suggests, Afghan Jihad and the rise of Taliban, what exactly we're looking at here is sort of motivations for this group called Taliban to rise amidst this crisis called Afghan Jihad, right? So when psychologists or scholars looking at the whole theory of motivation, right, they identify that there are two basic ways of motivating somebody to do something. One is an intrinsic factor where the individual is self-motivated to do something, while there is an extrinsic factor where there is the fear of the threat of punishment or the lure of incentive for him or her to work hard. I think we can extrapolate this framework to nation states as well to help to understand certain societies as well. Especially in the context of Afghanistan, we see that when the Afghan Jihad actually happened, there were both internal factors or what we call as intrinsic factors, and there was the international dimension, what we can call as the extrinsic factors. But adding to this, there was also something known as the atmospheric factor or the neighborhood factor. So looking at these three, I think we can understand what happened during the Afghan Jihad period, and then how that actually helped in the rise of the Taliban. So first of all, looking at the so-called intrinsic factor, the domestic factor. Here, what I would like to emphasize on is the concept of instability, right? It was instability within Afghanistan that actually led to the Afghan Jihad and subsequently to the rise of Taliban. So how did this instability actually play out? So in 1978, we had the Saur Revolution, right? Where we had the PDPA, the Gulf faction of the PDPA come to power, and then there were the sudden drastic political changes that came in. They introduced reforms such as democratic land reform, followed by certain measures to empower women. There were changes in the education curriculum and so on. Now, this actually backfired. This backfired because the Afghan Islamic groups, the tribal Islamists, actually fought back, right? So what we understand here is that in most democracies, when well-intending policies are imposed on societies that are not actually ready for the kind of change, it tends to backfire, right? So that was the primary impetus for the Afghan Jihad. The fact that a lot of these domestic groups, the tribal groups, were not ready for the kind of changes, kind of policies that the PDPA was sort of looking to impose on them. So that was the most primary thing we need to understand, because only then can we understand the Cold War dimension. Now, moving to the international sphere, when we speak about the Cold War dimension, when we speak about the training that the CIA gave to the Mujahideen in alliance with, of course, the Pakistani ISI to fight the Soviets, that is secondary to the fact that the Afghans themselves wanted to fight against these policies, right? So there was a deep connection between the domestic aspect and the international aspect. So I would consider both the Cold War dynamics as well as what happened in Afghanistan as part of the domestic dynamics. Now, coming to the international, international. So if domestic aspect was instability, the international aspect was the crisis that is brewing in the Islamic world, right? What happened in 1979? When you look at 1979, that was the year that we saw the Iranian Revolution, right? Right after the Iranian Revolution, in June 1979, for the first time we saw the Iranian radio actually broadcasting messages from the Islamic leader asking for the Afghans to rise up in arms, right? So very clearly there was a new power emerging within the Islamic world. That was the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, that actually coincided with two other events that happened one was in Pakistan, where following the revolution, the American embassy in Pakistan was attacked by certain elements who were pro-Iran, which is also supported by a group called Jamaat-e-Islami, right? So there's again political Islam brewing within Pakistan as well. At the same time, the holy Mecca in Saudi Arabia was taken over by certain fundamentalists who felt that the Saudi royal family was no more capable of, being the defender of Islam, right? So when the Saudi royal family felt that they have a threat from these fundamentalist organizations, that's when they picked up political Islam and started to use Islam as a tool of foreign policy, where they started to give more power to the ulama or the imams and so on. And so from then on, you see that there's a lot of funding for Wahhabi madrasas across South Asia, in Pakistan, on Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and so on and so forth. So you have the crisis in the Islamic world, which is actually compelling most of these international actors to partake in what was going to happen then. So when the CIA actually came up with the policy of supporting the Mujahideen, the Saudis were more than happy to join with them because they had their own problems to take care of, whether they were interested in the Cold War dynamics or not. They realized that political Islam is now rising and fundamentalism is on the rise, and the only way to pacify it is to ensure that it doesn't come back to bite them by exporting that to another location, right? So that is the international dynamic. And then there is a third, which is that of the atmospherics, or what we call as the environmental dimension or the neighborhood dimension. That is what Pakistan presented at that point in time. Because what we see is that in 1977, 1978, when General Zia-ul-Haq had come to power in Pakistan, he was not in good terms with the then Carter administration in the United States, right? So, and especially given the fact that he was sending the previous democratically elected leader, Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, to gallows, he was not in the good books of the United States, right? And so then he crafted a formula which is sort of followed on in Pakistan ever since, that whoever is in power in Pakistan, be it the military or the civilian leadership, they tend to pander to the fancies of these Islamist parties, the political Islamist parties, because they have a significant vote bank. So if you look at what happened during 77, 78, and 79 onwards, General Zia started to build alliances with the Jamaat-e-Islami of Pakistan, right? But around the time the Jamaat-e-Islami was getting powerful, there was another group also which was getting equally powerful, if not any lesser. That was the Jamaat-Ulema-Islami, right? The difference between these two groups was that the Jamaat-e-Islami was very much urban in its character. Most of its cadres were from the urban or semi-urban centers. But when you look at the Jamaat-e-Ulema-Islami, they come from the border region of Afghanistan, and they're predominantly rural in their character, right? And they also are predominantly Pashtun as well. So what happened at that point in time is, Zia-ul-Haq had utilized all of these groups in terms of training the Afghan Mujahideen, and we know what happened in Afghanistan then. But then coming closer to the withdrawal of the Soviet Union, and then since the topic that I'm supposed to actually talk about is the rise of the Taliban, right? So what happened during the 1990s is again very important, because during towards 1990, 91, 92, there's a significant change happening in the Pakistani politics with the coming of Benazir Bhutto and her people's, the PPP, Pakistan People's Party. Now, because of some historical factors, now for the uninitiated who does not understand Pakistani politics as much, I'd like to take you back to the 1970s. So that when Pakistan had two wings, that is the West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Before the creation of Bangladesh, it was observed that the Bhutto family, or the PPP, were basically known as Islamic socialists rather than Islamic radicalists or Islamic fundamentalists. But the socialism did not appeal to the right-wing Islamic groups, that is the Jamaat-e-Islami, right? So because they had fallen out with the Jamaat-e-Islami, they found that they could make alliances, build partnership with the Jamaat-Ulema-Islami, that's JUI. So they started empowering the JUI. Now, what happened at this point in time was most of the Taliban cadres were not yet Taliban at that point in time, who had entered Pakistan during the Afghan Jihad, became products of the madrasas established by the JUI, right? So this is an important point that we have to remember, because what the Taliban leadership that we saw during the 1990s when they were in power, most of them were trained in these madrasas that were established by the Jamaat Ulama Islami. So as a consequence, they were not only fed with this Wahhabi ideology that was being exported from Saudi Arabia, they also inherited certain ideas from pan-Islamist ideas from this group called JUI. So the foundation for the formation of the Taliban was laid here. But what actually triggered is now coming back to where we were, that is that of domestic factors, right? So instability led to instability along with crisis in the international forum led to what happened as a consequence of the a political conspiracy in the neighborhood. But then this again comes back to the domestic dimension, wherein now, after this withdrawal of the Soviet Union, instability once again continued, because initially if it is a problem of flawed policies, now it is the problem of not having a coherent government in Afghanistan. So after the withdrawal of Soviet Union in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, we observed that there was a power vacuum, there was a leadership crisis in Afghanistan, right? Especially the region of Kandahar, which was economically quite important for all the trade that was happening between Pakistan and the rest of Central Asian and West Asian world at that point in time. They became targeted by certain rogue elements, the warlords who had been initially trained by Pakistan and the CIA, but they had now turned the guns against anybody and everybody for the want of profits, right? So at that point in time, when this sort of an instability was brewing, it was under these circumstances that the Taliban walked in as a savior, right? So the Taliban came in at that point in time, and they ensured that there would be peace in that region. They took over Kandahar. If people actually remember today, in fact, the government of the day in Kabul, the leader of, Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was then the president of Afghanistan, he in fact appreciated the Taliban because they were fighting Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was one of the trained militants of Pakistan, but he was also, he was a nasty character. The Afghanistan government couldn't handle him, so they're more than happy to welcome Taliban at that point in time. And this reflected even in the kind of acceptance ratings that Taliban had with the general public as well. So we did see at that point in time that more than 50% of Afghan population were in fact in favor of Taliban bringing in stability. It is only much later that when they brought in certain policies which were quite unpalatable, that the ratings fell down. And even today, when the question of will the Taliban bring in stability to Afghanistan comes up, we see that there is a significant spike in the approval ratings. So I think that when we look at the question of Afghan Jihad, the rise of the Taliban and the ensuing instability in Afghanistan and so on, I think it is important to remember that there is a confluence of these three factors: the domestic, international, and the neighborhood factor. So each of them at some point in so the instability factor has been normal throughout, though for different reasons. But the nature and character of the international forces that have been acting on Afghanistan, barring Pakistan, have been changing over time, but nevertheless, they have been to the detriment of the average Afghan. So that is something we need to remember, and I think I'll end my talk here and look forward to questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dheeraj. That was a very thorough analysis of the historical reason of Taliban. And I think, we should leave the question at the end of the forum, if it's okay with you, So without wasting more time, I would like, to follow the agenda and just to go to the next speaker, who is Dr. Nanda Kishore, MS, who is an associate professor and head of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and coordinator of Center for Polish and Central European Studies at Manipal Academy of Higher Education in India. Just to point out that Dr. Nanda Kishore holds an MPhil and PhD in political sciences from Hyderabad Central University in India, and completed postdoc at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands with Erasmus Mundus Fellowship from the European Union. He has been teaching geopolitics in West Asia, India foreign policy, concept of war and peace in geopolitics, terrorism, and asymmetric conflict. Dr. Nanda Kishore will analyze on rise of Islamic fundamentalism in South Asia. Dr. Kishore, the floor is yours, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
I'm audible, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks to the chair for giving me an opportunity, and thanks to the Indic Forum for bringing so many scholars together. I think it's a very important occasion, and on top of it, the very topic that they have chosen, the fall of Kabul, the recalibration of the security challenges, and this particular session, and with regard to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, it's a very, very important topic to be discussed. I think the relevance is now, I think, more than ever because of the type of issues that are happening here. So I'll be speaking on the Islamic fundamentalism in South Asia, just going a little back and forth. The story so far is that with regard to South Asia, much prior to 1920s, we see a bit of it coming from through the invaders who came to India, and in one other form. They were also imposed component of it, and they got the type of support that was required by the regimes themselves. But after that one, I think the rise to the modern day, what we see as the idea of jihad, or the ideas that were put up in the form of, let's say, fundamentalism, because fundamentalism being a project of the West, we're returning to the fundamentals. From there to putting up their own ways of looking at it, it started off in 1924 with the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate, where again, the British played their own role to see to it that the Al-Sauds could come up and an alternate power system there. Because Ottomans held, in the name of religion, a very, very vast territory which they wanted to the British wanted the clutches to be removed, and then they wanted Al-Sauds to rise to see to it that they would take over some regions, and then the British would have control over. So with the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924, the phase that we see between 24 to 47 had its own impact here. We had our nationalist leaders fighting for saving the caliphate. That was on the one hand. Suddenly there was a movement that came in, and on top of it, within the Indian national movement, we see a break. In 1906, we saw the Muslim League coming in, and then subsequently the same Muslim League getting its own identity, trying to consolidate itself, and subsequently succeeding in having a country of its own based on communal lines, in the sense based on religion. That's a first of a kind in the whole of South Asia, where we see a state of Pakistan taking or emerging. But the period between 24 to 47 was a time which also reflected on the struggle that Islam went through, and the internal struggles it was trying to put up. There were too many issues that had to be dealt with. The First World War, the Second World War again had devastating effect, though they were not directly involved. But unfortunately, they all had to participate in one other way. The second phase is between 1947 to 89. Here where we see identity politics coming into the picture. Suddenly, across the spectrum, with the creation of Israel, the Arab nationalism becomes very, very important. The Muslim Brotherhood playing its own role. But then there was issue between the leaders who agreed on Arab nationalism, or the leaders who agreed on Muslim Brotherhood. They did not agree with other forms of it. Newer leaders had emerged by then. So there were issues of non-Arab states trying to get back to the fold and trying to become modern. On the other hand, the Arab states were going backwards because of the creation of Israel in 1948. Again, it gave rise for some sort of a consolidation where they could still use the modern terminology, or the older terminology in the modern sense, the idea of jihad, taking it to the next level. This is also a phase where there were numerous conflicts in different parts. The identities were touched, and identities were also getting involved in a lot of other political happenings including that of Pakistan, which we will be seeing. Partially, my colleague Dr. Dheeraj touched upon Zia, but I will be dealing in detail, because when it comes to South Asia, their story or Zia's story is much more important and we need to remember. So this phase happens between 47 to 89, in which a lot of things happen, including that of the Afghan war, and then the ideology, the problems with the ideology, and then many other states coming in, and then Afghanistan becoming a place of experiment where smaller groups came together to defeat the giant or a superpower, which gave a different sort of a feeling for most of the smaller organizations as well as individuals, that when you are on a mission and when the God is on your side, you just don't need to fear whether it is a superpower or anybody. To be precise, even if it is the story of the David and the Goliath probably was much more appreciated here, saying that with the good, the God always stays, and he will see to it that the victory is them. So this, in fact, inspired a lot of organizations which were already troubling India in the South Asian region with regard to Kashmir, with regard to many other components that were existing. Now, with the 1989 victory that the groups got, the consolidation period started here. You see rise of Osama bin Laden. You also see many others coming into picture. The Taliban got its own shape to consolidate power in Afghanistan. The amalgamation of so many organizations and their allegiance to certain groups, including that of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda almost became like the organization in the world that was representing Islamic Jihad, and the Islamists all were looking up to them. And this is perhaps a period that is much more important for understanding the Islamic fundamentalism in South Asia. To be precise, with 9/11 happening, and then that again it was seen as a victory for the Islamist groups. Again, waging jihad on a superpower was not far away, and that was led by Osama bin Laden and the group. It is also a time there were other fragmentations. We also saw quite a few leaders falling, including Osama bin Laden. So 2014, it gave rise to some of the splinter groups with taking advantage of the Arab Spring. Numerous groups started coming in, and one such group declared itself to be a caliphate of the modern idea. Nobody ever imagined in 2014 we would have a caliphate based on religious grounds, on extreme ideas, and that exactly happened. Now 2014, with the caliphate emerging, I think it again further consolidated this scenario, and I call this period as the emergence of the imminent, where it gave a futuristic understanding of where it would be heading to. This is precisely when, even from the nook and corner of South Asia, Southeast Asia, to all the places, so I'm restricting myself to South Asia, people started going in, everybody started realizing, or every other group started feeling that they need to be part of this one. If not now, when else? And they also felt this is a golden moment. If they would not take part, they would almost be seen as betrayers, or they would be seen as those who turned their back to the God. And this is the sort of story, these were the type of brainwashes that started happening across the spectrum in South Asia, and a lot of them went and started contributing. If you look at the base and the rationale for the fundamentalism in South Asia, first and foremost was, as I mentioned, through the time period, the pursuit of establishing what we call as the Nizam al-Islami, which was modeled on the Medinian Caliphate, was the idea. I said already the Ottoman collapsed, so there was something else that had to come in here, where other ideologies, other protest ways, or other ways of expressing themselves, let's say the protest ideologies, nationalism, socialism, anti-imperialist, national egalitarian, including the non-aligned. There were so many other things that came to them. Unfortunately, none of them could bring all the people together. None of them could hit the emotions properly. I think it is precisely here when the Islamization part, or fundamentalism, or the Islamic fundamentalism actually started taking root. So the idea was re-Islamization from below. This is how it started. This particular process is facilitated by the fact that Islam at the level of masses provided a frame of reference for their collective identity and a symbol of self-assertion rooted in their traditions itself. Because rest of the things had one or the other way been problematic. Okay, they could use them on certain occasions, but let's say something associated with a communist ideology or socialism, these were problematic because they were seen as anti-religion. There were certain problems that were associated. So somewhere or the other, they had to take on those lines. They also had to differentiate between we and they. And on the other hand, the problems were associated with other important issues of the states being not very, very strong. The states themselves were unable to get hold of their masses. They were not able to convey what exactly the states were supposed to do with regard to governance. So people had to fight their own, or people had to find their own ways of dealing with life. And precisely Islam was, or the conservative component of Islam, or the extreme side of Islam, gave them that particular platform. Now, certainly this was not a homogeneous movement. There's no doubt about it. They share some common denominations as they draw on key assumptions of themes, such as the need for liberating mankind from the state of godless Jahiliyyah, as I mentioned, and the establishing of an Islamic order for the actualization of the Muslim life, because the religious text also very clearly says who is and who is not. Then the idolaters, those of them who turn back, and who are all these people. Perhaps very, very clear ways of expressing, due to which the interpretations were also easy and the actions added up to it. This was something that was conveyed. Second, the lack of education in many of the states in South Asia with very, very poor infrastructure. People looked up to the mullahs. People looked up to those who were preaching, who took liberty in interpretation, liberty in the way they wanted to push their identity, as well as insert certain extreme radical thoughts in South Asian countries. It is here that the madrasa started playing in. That's where I come to Zia-ul-Haq, the 11 years of the military rule. Perhaps I had given this example. I keep giving this example even in my classes to my students, where we see hardly 850 madrasas that were existing in all over Pakistan during his time, because of the type of support that he started getting from the Gulf countries. It ended up, by the end of his 11 years, it reached closer to 18,000 madrasas. You can imagine the type of education that they imparted. Most of the curriculum was against other religions. Most of the things that were taught to them was to say what makes an individual a good Muslim, rather than that when they were preaching how actually to eliminate those of them who are not Muslims, or how to establish an Islamic rule across the world, and how that is the issue of a life. Now, Deobandi ulama as well as Jamaat-e-Islam guided Zia's this brand of Islamization and became the military's partners in the Afghan war. Here, where we see a deadly or a poisonous cocktail between religion and the military coming together, which continues to be the same case even today. That's something that we speak about. This morning, we had a documentary in my department where some of the students were explaining how a terrorist leader could just stay so close to a military headquarters or a military station. This is precisely because of whatever the foundations that were laid by some of these leaders. The Mullah-military alliance developed to what we see in today's manifestation itself. Now, South Asian states, if you again going further from there, Zia used Islam not simply for the purpose of regime legitimacy, but to neutralize the rising tide of Islamist activism to form what we call as the Order of the Prophet, which is also called as Nizam-e-Mustafa movement in the late 1970s, following up till 1989. That is his term, perhaps the most dangerous term, unfortunate term for South Asian states itself. He co-opted sections of Islamist opposition and isolating others, at the same time blustering state power and capacity itself. On the other hand, we see Zia-ur-Rahman not trying to play with it, but at the same time fearing what would happen in that day's East Pakistan and subsequently becoming Bangladesh. We see Zia coming into picture again, and then subsequently the role played by Khaleda Zia, where she came much, much closer to Jamaat-e-Islami and many other organizations, joined hands with Pakistan and started the movement into a different way, almost patronizing most of the terrorist organizations which were into Islamic fundamentalism. Now, because Pakistan and Bangladesh are a known story, and moving further to Sri Lanka, where in Sri Lanka, the Islamic fundamentalism actually started off much earlier, though the Muslims went there because of the Portuguese, where they were called as the Moorish, and then they have all these groups, including the Ahmadiyya. They also have certain Indonesian population, but together all of them as a dominant component, they also consolidated themselves as a resistance movement because of the LTT also abusing at some point of time. But it's later stage when they started asserting, they also started getting influenced by radicalization. It is precisely here that the institutions such as Tablighi, many other also started influencing them. ISIS made a very big time inroad. This is something that happened in some of the very important provinces, where in a small region of less than 50,000 people staying, they had closer to 85 mosques. In the sense, the identity started becoming so important. On top of it, when the wealth also started adding up, this had gone to a different level, which manifested in what we see as the Easter Day attack. And subsequently, now Sri Lanka has been taking care of it, but yet I think the imminent threat is so strong that the state of Sri Lanka is trembling, and it still hasn't come out of the shock that it went through. But it has its own legacy. It has its own ways of looking at this particular problem in the region. Now, Maldives is torn between, because they move into the fundamentalist side of it. They would want to come back to it. I think it also depends on their political regime. But nevertheless, it's been seen that these days there is huge struggle between the Islamic fundamentalism that's existing in Maldives, and the way state is trying to promote on the one hand and to constrain on the one hand, because politically that is required. But then in terms of longer sustenance and their image across the world, they find it problematic. That's something that I'm trying to leave it there. But there are different type of components that come here, where political violence and security risks are looked at. Jihadism, then Islamism is political activism, security and the public order risks that they look at. Islamic fundamentalism, where non-political activities in the public order is in threat. And then you have the last part. It's not to say that in all these states, all the Muslims, all the groups are into this one, but it is precisely the middle one that we are talking about, which is extremely dangerous, along with the top layer that we see as jihadism. So it starts off from the lower level, where tolerant Islam component is there. Then you have the Islamic fundamentalism, Islamism, and then finally leading to jihadism, which is an extreme form where they would want to eliminate people. These are simple numbers that I'm trying to give to the audience. How much political influence should religious leaders have? It's very interesting that you see the states of Bangladesh and Afghanistan, all those places, as well as Pakistan. In all these places, the rating is comparatively very high, apart from the West Asian states. Now, who are backing the Sharia law? Because this is also important. If we are moving towards fundamentalism, there has to be certain indicators. If you look at South Asia is stopping in this one. This is precisely why I said the imminent threat, because the direction that in which it is moving, or the direction in which they are anticipating certain states to, that means they're so clear that what they want to bring in is visible in this one, because it's way ahead of even, let's say, Middle East and North Africa, who own the whole component of what we call, or what we're discussing here. But South Asia is planning to take over that one. That's an issue of anxiety, but at the same time, numbers speak it all. If we look at, again, the average GTA scores, that is the terrorism index that we look at every year that has been published. Again, here we see South Asia having a higher score, or an overall score at the top, again leading or going beyond all these things because of the presence of Afghanistan. But nevertheless, this is not the trend that we are trying to look at. Attacks and deaths, again, here also South Asia, though comparatively in terms of the deaths that we are looking at, it's low because of existence of Syria and Iraq. Apart from that one, South Asia is in second position, and I think perhaps it's also going in a way that can be very dangerous. This is a graph that we see from 2002 to 2019, which also speaks volumes about how the fundamentalism or the Islamic fundamentalism is taking shape, where it is leading to the extreme form of jihad. It's leading to the extreme idea of political change that they're anticipating in the region itself, which I just showed with few other examples, with giving the genesis of it and a timeline that probably will give a clear picture for us where South Asia stands with regard to Islamic fundamentalism. The paucity of time, I would want to stop it here, and I would take up questions at the end or whenever the chair deems it fit. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nanda Kishore, for the really deeply analyzing and elaborating on the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in South Asia, especially for the participant, from Europe, or the North America. We do really appreciate it, your analysis, even though the people in Southeast Asia might be familiar with that, but for us, is really an enriching, speech, coming from your side. We thank you very much on the behalf of the Indic Researchers Forum, sir. And now we just go to our last distinguished speaker, the distinguished Professor Dr. Christian Kaunert, a well-known professor all over the places, especially in Europe, which professor of international security at Dublin City University in Ireland. Also, Professor Kaunert is also professor on policy and security, as well as director of the International Center for Policy and Security at the University of South Wales in the United Kingdom. He's also European editor of the Journal of European and American Intelligence Studies. In addition, he's a Jean Monnet Chair, director of the Jean Monnet Chair of Excellence and director of the Jean Monnet Network on EU counterterrorism. Previously, he served as the academic director and professor at the Institute for European Studies of Retd University in Brussels, a professor of international politics, head of discipline in politics, and director of the European Institute for Security and Justice, the Jean Monnet Center for Excellence at the University of Dundee, Scotland. Professor Kaunert has researches and taught in many international universities, just to point out some of them, such as the University of Shanghai, Jinan in China, eBay in Barcelona in Spain, Diplomatic Academy in Yerevan, Armenia, United Nations Development Mission, University of Cairo in Egypt, Collegio Carlo Alberto in Turin, Italy, École Nationale of Administration in Paris, European Institute of Public Administration Maastricht in the Netherlands, European Studies Institute in Moscow, University of Porto in Portugal, University de Antioquia Medellín and the University de la Sabana, Bogota, and the University of Diego de Cali, Colombia. Professor Kaunert is really a well-known international professor. He has taught in most of the university all over the world, and it's really a great pleasure to have Professor Kaunert to share his knowledge with us, because as you realize, one of the biggest problems we face today in Europe is about the refugee crisis. And one more point that I would like to make, you are familiar that the European Commission does not have a European migration policy. What does it mean? Well, in this kind of question, Professor Kaunert will be able, to give some replies to this, speech today related to the refugee crisis and security threats to West, question mark. Professor Kaunert, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Nomikos. Thank you very much, John, for this wonderful introduction. This was very, very kind. Thank you very much also for the Indic Researchers Forum for having invited me. It's such a great pleasure to be there with you today. And I hope that as soon as the pandemic is over, we will also be able to meet each other face to face. So thank you very much for having me here. The topic that I want to talk to you today is, of course, the impact of the fall of Afghanistan and the takeover of the Taliban on Europe, and in particular, the impact on the refugee crisis, very, very hotly debated topic in Europe, certainly since 2015, very, very much so, but even before then. So it is something very, very important, and I hope that I can bring you a little European perspective on how this crisis has been perceived. So let me start with a little background. I mean, the previous two speakers have given us a fantastic background in terms of the actual conflict in Afghanistan. So I won't go through this in any great detail, but I will go straight to the refugee crisis fairly soon, just to say that, of course, Afghanistan has had a long history of those internal and external conflicts, 2 wars with the United Kingdom, invasion by the Soviet Union, and of course the takeover of the Taliban. It's a country that is at a crossroads of a variety of different neighboring states with ancient trade routes, differing religions, major powers, buffer state, and of course for the West, for the United States and for Europe, it really got into the focus of what we all kind of really wanted to know more about. It was, of course, a terror attack on the World Trade Center in New York on September 11, 2001. This is political memory that has shaped, obviously, my own research. This is something that really drew me in. And of course, as a result of that, I really focused a lot of my research on terrorism and counterterrorism. At the time, Osama bin Laden was identified, of course, as the leader of that terror organization, and subsequently was hunted down by the US government in a military compound in Pakistan, where he was eventually killed. In 1996, the Taliban, of course, took over and seized control of most of the country already. The Taliban at the time was already accused of supporting terrorists, and subsequently the Americans, after the September 11 attack, began conducting airstrikes on Taliban facilities in Afghanistan, and so on. We all know the outcome, but only to mention this to give a little background, because of course when we talk about refugees, this little background is very important. So I want to give you a little background to make you understand the difficulty that we're facing today. Of course, the Taliban, when they were initially in power, they were gaining world prominence even before the 9/11 attack, when they destroyed the historic Buddhist religious art, which was one of the very horrific kind of examples of the Taliban rule at the time, that certainly in the West gained a lot of prominence. Subsequent to their takeover at the time, Afghanistan already constituted, and certainly today constitutes, one of the largest single refugee population in the entire world. There's about 6 million people, 30% of the global refugee population that is Afghan. The population has been greatly affected by refugee problems for many years. A number of those refugees are, of course, in Pakistan. A number of them are also in neighboring countries, whether that is in Iran, whether that is in other neighboring countries. Areas that were under Taliban controlled, of course, as you very well know, women had to wear burqas outside of their home. They had to be covered from head to toe. Schools were closed for girls. Professional women lost their jobs, were not permitted to work outside the home. 30,000 widows in Kabul had been denied employment. We're seeing some of those issues return subsequent to the takeover of the Taliban. Women had to endure very harsh treatment by the Taliban, whether that included beating women, executing women, and so on. So all of this is to say that, of course, a lot of people, a lot of refugees that were coming from Afghanistan were, of course, really persecuted in a way that I think many places in the world haven't seen. The kind of persecution that took place in Afghanistan was something that really was in a class or on its own. So one would think, to a certain extent, of course, that after the fall of the Taliban, there would be an outpouring of empathy and sympathy towards a lot of these people. When we look, however, empirically, what has really happened at the end of the summer of this year, following that swift conquest of Afghanistan by the Taliban, when interior ministers of the European Union met, they met for the first time on the 31st of August of this year, in order to discuss the potential implications in the area of international protection, migration, and security. When they concluded their meeting, their statement suggested, and in fact emphasized, their intention to support third countries in particular in their asylum capacity, with a view to ensure that those in need of protection receive it, and this is the important part, in their region of origin. So ministers highlighted that the EU and its member states would do their utmost to ensure that the situation in Afghanistan does not lead to new security threats for EU citizens, and they underlined the timely performance of security checks of persons being evacuated from Afghanistan. That would remain crucial. It was a very strongly worded statement, perhaps a statement that we may not have expected before. Certainly, when we compare the situation to 2015, 14, 15, certainly this is a much stronger statement that was also echoed in other declarations made by European leaders in the margins of that very meeting. If we look at the Interior Minister of Slovenia, he declared that European leaders were afraid that this situation could result in terror attacks on EU soil. German Interior Minister Horst Seehofer also argued against identifying a target number of refugees from Afghanistan to be resettled in the EU, because those numbers obviously would trigger a pull effect, and we don't want that. All those declarations were met with obviously outrage with a number of non-governmental organizations and were criticized. But what they do show is that these debates have significantly changed since 2015 in Europe. Asylum seekers fleeing from Afghanistan in 2021 have largely been seen as security threats in the EU, and particularly at the level of member states. This is puzzling to a certain extent because of what I told you initially, that of course they are seen traditionally as victims, and in fact particularly when we look at the horrors of what the Taliban had been doing when they took over power the first time, and what can be expected perhaps also now, they were in fact victims of the perpetrators of very horrific violence. Nonetheless, at the level of European governments, this is increasingly seen as a security threat. Now, you might ask then, so how come these refugees and asylum seekers are being seen by European countries as a security threat? And I think at this point, it is very important to point back to the situation in 2015 and 2016, because without understanding the situation in 2015, we cannot understand the reaction of European governments as we see it today. In 2015, we see that a lot of, in a sense, a lot of European governments, in particular the German government, I mean, this was the most symbolic statement that, of course, German Chancellor Angela Merkel made at the time when she said, we're welcoming those refugees with open arms. She kind of allowed quite a large number of refugees to come into Europe at the time. Some may argue that she didn't really have much of a choice because a lot of them were already on European territory, and I think Professor Nomikos knows this very well, of the situation in Greece that happened at the time. So a number of people might say she didn't really have a choice. It wasn't necessarily a policy decision as such, but it was something that she was sort of forced into. But nonetheless, the lesson that the German establishment drew from the situation in 2015, certainly other European countries as well. If we look at other major European powers, such as France, if we look at the decision-making in the United Kingdom, if we look at Italy, if we look at a large number of European countries, their idea initially that was undermined, of course, then by a number of terror attacks that occurred subsequent to allowing about 1.2 million refugees into the European Union in 2015. We had the terror attacks in Paris. We had a terror attack in Brussels. We had a terror attacks in Berlin. We had a variety of different terror attacks. Now, you may say, were they really refugees? And of course, this situation is debatable whether all of them were refugees. And of course, it is debatable whether, in fact, some of them had very close connections. But it is also been argued that at least part of that kind of asylum route had been used in order for some people that may otherwise have found it very difficult to enter the European Union, to enter the European Union without being fully checked, without being fully controlled. And as a result of that, that has led to a certain insecurity. But more importantly than only the security threat, the political repercussions were very, very significant in the European Union. Certainly, the decision to allow a lot of those refugees into Europe was one of the reasons why subsequently Chancellor Angela Merkel decided not to run again in the next elections in Germany, which are being held just tomorrow. And she decided to step down as the leader of her party. We see similar things in other European countries where we see an increase in far-right movements that have made it very difficult for policy and decision makers to draw the same conclusions that occurred in 2015. So this is then fundamentally how we arrive at the situation in 2021, where when faced with potentially, and here I go back to my initial statistic, Afghan refugees are roughly about 30% of all the global refugee population. So they are a very significant refugee population, globally speaking. They're of course not all in Europe, but the potential is there for a lot of people to eventually make their way into Europe. In the face of such a political development, the reflexes in Europe are very, very clear. This is being seen as a potential security threat, particularly with the knowledge that, of course, when the Taliban take over the country, and as Professor Nomikos pointed out, when the Haqqani network, in a sense, leads the Interior Ministry in Afghanistan, an organization that has obviously been nominated as a terror organization for several years by the US government and by others, that does not reassure European governments that Afghanistan does not become, in a sense, a breeding ground for future terror attacks. And of course, using the refugee route is one of the ways in which those people may or may not enter the European Union. European governments at this point are not willing to take that risk anymore. And this has been said very, very clearly. And I think we're going to see iterations of those statements over the next couple of months. No matter which government is going to take office in Germany after the elections tomorrow, we will see a relative unity, I think, on this particular point. We will see that other European countries, certainly France, that has its presidential elections next year, where President Emmanuel Macron is likely to have to run off in a second round against Marine Le Pen, potentially would be very, very vulnerable to even lose the election if he were to give significant ground on those issues. So my statement here at the end is not necessarily to say whether or not refugees are a security threat, but certainly from the perspective of European governments, I think the question has been answered affirmatively, and we are going to see measures. Certainly, if we look at the eastern flank at the moment, we see how they've already been used for a kind of a hybrid warfare, when of course President Lukashenko of Belarus has already been using some of them, developing new flight routes from Iraq and from Syria into Belarus in order then to push the refugees or migrants, illegal migrants, depending on how you look at them, into Poland, into the Baltic republics. So we see that potential could be there also for Afghan refugees. There's a very significant number of Afghan refugee population. Of course, we see potential adversary countries such as Iran that could play that role in particular. Also, Turkey, of course, has been playing that role for a while on occasions in order to gain leverage in terms of money, but also other political. So European countries are going to try their very best not to go down that route. And as a result of that, they're unlikely to entertain anything like what we've seen in 2015. In fact, this has become almost like a essential statement of domestic politics in a number of countries. Certainly in Germany, it has become that way. So I will end on this note. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Connor, for your realistic approach to what we are facing today in Europe. And just to say that President Macron declared that France is taking action starting today on Muslim Brotherhood in France. So as Professor Kaune said, some measures are taking place. Now, Mr. Aria, do we have some time for question? At least we have 10 to 15 minutes before we go to the next forum. Distinguished participant, now the floor is yours to ask, our three, speaker, Dr. Dheeraj, Dr. Nanda Kishore, and of course, Dr. Krisha Kauner. Please, if you like to ask, just raise your head and just address your question to each one of the speakers. Please go ahead. If we have any question, of course, please.
So we have a question for Dr. Nanda Kishore in the chat box. If you want to take up, or I'll say, Dr. Nanda Kishore, the question has been asked by Dipanshu Dhruv. He's saying India is already facing the jihadist threat in Kashmir. So what can be the possible consequences of the re-emergence of reunited Pakistan Taliban in the Indian border regions?
We have two questions. Let me see. One is coming from Dipanshu Dhruv, if I spell the name correctly. For Dr. Nanda Kishore, India is already facing the jihadist threat in Kashmir. So what can be the possible consequences of the re-emergence of a reunited Pakistan Taliban in the Indian border region? This question is coming from Mr. Dipanshu Dhruv, and it's addressed to Dr. Nanda Kishore. Mr. Kishore, the floor is yours.
I guess sir is not available now.
He's not available. Okay. So I don't know if you want to just somebody to ask reply to that, but I would like to ask a question, to the speakers, because as we said, that the Haqqani network is present as the Minister of the Interior in Kabul. He's coming from this network. How possible is the Taliban government to provide stability and security inside the country, and also how possible is the Taliban security community to be manipulated by the security and tele community in Pakistan, and how India could counterbalance this close collaboration between Taliban and the Pakistani security and intelligence community. Is that a threat to India security? And what happens if Baluchistan becomes independent inside Pakistan? How this is going to destabilize, the borders between Pakistan and the Taliban and affect India security? Number one. And number two, Professor Kauner talked about the refugee. He compared 2015, 2017. And I think what we are going to see on the German election might affect a lot next week how the Europeans are going to defend, because remember that next year, like Professor Kauner said, we have election in France. So we see the nationalist parties, moving up, and in Germany we might see a social democrat party moving up. Because of the refugee crisis, many voters in Europe, take more the nationalistic versus socio-democratic approach. So this is something that Professor Kaunas made an observation. But just addressing my question to the distinguished scholar from India, how this close collaboration between Pakistani and the Taliban security intelligence community might affect the domestic security in India. Dr. Dheeraj and Dr. Kishore, can you tell us, can you reply to that?
Yeah, okay. I'll take up the first part of the question that you asked. So, when you go back in history to the time of 1947-48, when the subcontinent was divided by the British, so these are artificially created borders by British cartographers between Pakistan and Afghanistan, what we call as the Durand Line. Now, if we go back to the time and look at what was actually happening, most of the countries recognized Pakistan, right? The idea of a nation for Muslims, the subcontinent Muslims. But it was Afghanistan was the only country that did not recognize Pakistan and did not agree to its admission to the United Nations. So that has been the real bone of contention between Pakistan and Afghanistan, that the Durand Line has not been accepted as a border by Afghanistan. Now, what happened during the 70s, and in fact, it was during 1973 that the then Prime Minister of Afghanistan, who actually tried with the help of the Soviets to sort of nullify the Durand Line and then occupy the adjacent areas in Pakistan, what is to form what we call as the Pashtunistan, or have it within the Afghan border itself. But then that really backfired because the Pakistanis then started training people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Yunus Khalis, and so on. Now, what has happened then was the Pakistanis realized once the Afghan jihad got over and when the Taliban was on the ascendance, they realized one thing: there is a tribal elite in Afghanistan and there is a religious elite in Afghanistan. The tribal elite is always going to become a problem to Pakistan because they're going to see themselves as Pashtun first and only then as something else. Whereas the religious elite is going to see themselves as Muslim first and then anything else. So the Taliban fit into that definition of being a religious elite first, right? Because they were trained in the Pakistani madrasas, and they felt that this Taliban could actually do Pakistan's bidding within Afghanistan. And to a certain degree, they were right. But gradually what happened was, after the Taliban came to power, they realized that some Taliban leaders were sort of seeking autonomy. They wanted to make their own decisions, and they fell out of favor from ISI. And that is when you see many of the strategic leadership then were arrested by the ISI itself on when the CIA asked them to. Today, what has happened is the Taliban themselves has sort of improved in terms of strategic thought, strategic thinking. They're no more the ragtag militia that they were then. They're no more, yes, they are Islamist in their outlook, but they're also quite strategic. They're looking out to reach out to foreign partners and so on. So the Pakistanis want to ensure that they have certain control over the policies made in Kabul if and when Taliban comes to power. And I think that is the reason why there is an insistence on having Sirajuddin Haqqani, the Haqqani network leader, as the interior minister. So that, if the Taliban tends to overstep and take up policies that are in the best interest of Afghanistan and not in the interest of Pakistan, then they have a certain lever to press. Now, how does all of this have an impact on India? Well, it's too early to say it with any authority, but the point is that there is this ascendance of the Islamic State in Khorasan, what we call ISIS-K. Now that they have certain cadres who also belong to the Lashkar-e-Taiba, who are pro-Pakistan or who are controlled by the Pakistan military and have a very strong interest in destabilizing India. But considering all that has been happening in the last few years and having seen the strength of India's counterintelligence and security prowess, I think it will be quite difficult for them to pull off any stunts, military adventurism like the way they pulled off in the 1990s in India. But nevertheless, there would still be attempts made to sort of to have at least few attacks in the Kashmir, and then have a surveillance on the Indian military capabilities on the Indian coastline, at least, where there are a lot of installations which are tempting targets for terrorists. But in the immediate future, I don't think there is going to be anything significant. Pakistan also is in a deep mess because of its own economic problem, and China now has very different interests in Afghanistan with the CPC and BRI. So, as much as Pakistan would love to export jihad to India, I think its abilities to do so, at least as far as the incumbent government and the present structures are in place, institutions and security structures are in place, I think their ability to do so is quite limited.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. We have two questions for Professor Kauner, and after 10 minutes, we have to adapt, our panel. Professor Kauner, the first question is for you from Mr. Dibanshu. He said, is China on excuse to deal with the vacuum left by the United States withdrawal, altered and redrawing Asian geopolitical map, and capable of persuading the Taliban into a path of peaceful coexistence? Number one question for you. And the number two is coming from Mary Philip. Do you think that the world will have to deal with a much more violent and adamant Taliban, specifically because of the unworried interface of the American forces as against and comparatively might say the stand in the foreign interference has been curtailing in a certain extent? These two questions, Professor Carnett, is for you. And after that, I would just, with the permission from Mr. Aria, because the time is running out, to have a couple of minutes to just address the last question to Dr. Dheeraj. But before I do that, please, Professor Kauner, give us your short reply about these two questions that I just addressed to you.
Excellent, thank you. I'll keep it quite short. I think the first question is China anxious to fill the vacuum left by US withdrawal. I think that's a very clear yes. We've already seen China posing in pictures with the Taliban. So I think that they're anxious to fill that vacuum. There's no doubt about that. And we have already noticed that China has given a very, very strong focus in its own interest with what concerns Afghanistan. So I think there's no doubt that they're intending to fill that vacuum. Then the second part of the question is a little bit more tricky. Are they capable of persuading the Taliban onto a path of peaceful coexistence? Certainly, China is not interested to deal with partners that are committing violent and terror attacks. So I think what they would prefer, of course, is a partner that to a certain extent is just dealing with what they need to be dealing with. But does that necessarily convince the Taliban? Of course, there is potential there. There is, of course, the potential in terms of natural resources that China needs, that Afghanistan has, that could provide a potential to perhaps calm the situation. But I'd be skeptical as to how much that is terribly possible, because, of course, the two previous speakers gave us a very good outline of where the Taliban come from, where their ideology is from, and how this all affects the decision-making that will now happen in Afghanistan. We have the Haqqani network in terms of the Interior Ministry. So I'd be slightly doubtful as to whether that is entirely possible to persuade them necessarily into a path of peaceful coexistence. Also, we shouldn't forget that it isn't since yesterday that Afghanistan had a very turbulent history, that there have been a lot of conflicts over the centuries, in fact. So to think that the Taliban could now unilaterally take over what is a very tumultuous area and bring peace to it, I think doesn't sit very well with me. I'd be very skeptical that this is possible. Now, in terms of the second question, will the world have to deal with a much more violent and adamant Taliban? Specifically, well, I don't know about the unwanted interference, but certainly will that necessarily lead to a more violent form of the Taliban? Now, we can certainly see some elements of the Taliban that want to give the appearance that they have moderated. But let's go back to 1996. The Taliban at the time was saying some of the similar things that we're seeing right now. They were also saying that, this is not that women are not allowed to go to school or to universities. This is only to protect them. And once they're protected, then they can obviously go. But obviously that didn't happen then, and I think it's unlikely to happen now. So I think this is a diplomatic strategy that is targeted at the outside world. This is not a reflection of how they're intending to run Afghanistan. So I would imagine that we are seeing more or less the Taliban as they were. There may be elements that may moderate them to a certain extent, and I think some of the trade could be one of those issues, and obviously legitimacy that they're intending to gain from the international community may moderate them to a certain extent as well. But we also need to be realistic how much that can be moderated. The kind of form of Islamist terrorism that is kind of symbolized by the Taliban is not a form that is so easily moderated. So we have to be realistic of what can be achieved. Does it necessarily mean that it's going to be more violent and more adamant? Well, that's also difficult to say. I mean, certainly now that the Taliban have taken over, I think it's obvious that Al-Qaeda is going to take a stronger hold on Afghanistan. We will probably see a certain competition also then with ISIS and Daesh. All of that wouldn't lead me to think that things are going to be very peaceful there. I think there's certainly potential for things to be very, very violent in the near future, but it isn't a definitive development. But we certainly shouldn't think that the rhetoric that has come out of the Taliban is necessarily going to lead to a more moderate form either. So we have to be careful and we need to watch. And certainly we need to look at actions, not words. I think that is very important because the actions so far don't necessarily lead us to think that things are going to be more moderate and more peaceful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Counts. Now, respecting the time of the agenda, we have 5 minutes, and the last question is to Mr. Dheeraj from Sebastian Paul, who said that, do you believe, sir, that there would be a secret alliance between Taliban and ISIS? It means the Islamic State, but also ISIS, that means the Pakistan Intelligence Service, and other Islamic fundamentalists in the name of Islam, and that would threaten the entire world. This is for you, Mr. Dheeraj.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sebastian, for that question. Well, the thing about Islamic fundamentalism or the threat of Islamic fundamentalism to the entire world per se that comes from South Asia or the Afghanistan region, like I mentioned, one, there is the Afghanistan factor, and then there's the Pakistan factor, and then there is the Islamic world factor, right? Today, when you look at it, the Taliban, yes, we don't know what kind of monolith or a behemoth it's going to turn out to be. That's something that the future will sort of reveal. But when it comes to the ISI is first and foremost a military organization. It is a military intelligence organization, right? And also a counterintelligence organization. So they have their own organizational interest to take care of, right? So they might have promoted Islamism in the past and they continue to do so for their own political reasons and foreign policy reasons. But when it comes down to the heart of it, if they had to choose between protecting their own organizational interests and that of Islam, they would always tilt to protecting their own organization. And the best case that I can think of is in the 1990s. So they had this chief of ISI, whose name was Javed Nasir, right? He was very rabid in his views against, he was anti-America, he was anti-Israel, he was a hardcore Islamist. And the West actually came down really hard on Pakistan, telling that, if you really want us to be friends, then this guy has to go. And the ISI was more than happy to let him go. Because they felt that having these kind of characters would actually trouble their organizational interests. And he then went on and happily joined the Tablighi Jamaat. So there are these things which show that the Pakistan Army or the Pakistan ISI is more of an organization that is using Islam as a tool to further its own interests rather than having any real intention of Islamizing the world. Right, and the same thing with some of the Middle Eastern countries, the Islamic world countries as well. Like I mentioned, Saudi Arabia wanted to counter Iran on the one hand, and at the same time wanted to have an insurance policy against Islamic fundamentalists in its own land, and that's the reason they started to support Taliban. In fact, before the 1998 attacks in Nairobi, the Al-Qaeda attacks in Africa, the embassy bombings, right? If you remember, in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Before that, the Saudi intelligence chief, Al-Turki, was actually trying to negotiate with the Taliban simply because the Ministry of Religious Endowments in Saudi Arabia were very close to the Taliban. So he couldn't have overridden them and done something to them. but it was only the attacks that gave him the necessary wherewithal to actually go hard on Taliban and call back their ambassador. Similarly, today we see that Qatar has been supporting all sorts of Islamic groups around the world for the simple reason because they are facing a sort of crisis within that region. And so today they see that because they don't have the significant clout that they require in that region, one of the ways to do it is to support the Taliban. So I think that these nation states, irrespective of their Islamic character or otherwise, they have their own national interests to look to, and at the same time, Pakistan IS has its own organizational interest to protect. And it's only some of these Islamic organizations such as ISIS or Al Qaeda that have a pan-Islamist agenda. So I think there are differences between these three, and we shouldn't be clubbing all of them under one umbrella and looking at them as a single unit. And maybe to just answer the next question that somebody has asked about why Indian, and this is quite important, when we say that Indian Muslims are different from the rest of the South Asian Muslims. I think that some of these polls that are conducted and where the average Muslim gets to vote, I think they are not reflective of what the collective voice of the Indian Muslim is, because when you look at certain institutions like the Jamaat-e-Islami in India, they do not have this rabid fundamentalist viewpoint. Say, for instance, after the 26/11 attacks that happened in Mumbai in 2008, they were quite upfront in saying that we are not going to let any of these lane terrorists to be buried in India. Right. So whenever there's been an Islamic terrorist attack on India, these groups have been Islamic, Muslim groups have been more than they've been eager to support the Indian nation, to uphold the sovereignty of India rather than promote Islamic tendencies. So that is where I think that this whole idea of the Indian Muslim being different from from the other South Asian Muslims comes from an empirical point of view. Otherwise, you could have scholars go into the nitty-gritties of what Indian Islam talks about or what West Asian Islam talks about. So that is where the fundamental difference lies. But if you come down to the opinions of the average Indian Muslim, just like any average Indian Hindu, I think the opinions keep differing, and we don't need to pay much attention to them so long as they don't have a political expression.
Okay, thank you very much.
Do you want me to, Chair? Yes, do you want me to respond to that, or we are running out of time?
No, we are on time, but we'll give you, a few minutes to respond, and after that, I have to close the session because I don't want to be out of control of the agenda. Please give us your response shortly.
Okay. To the question that Dr. Dheeraj also tried answering, it's torn between, as I mentioned, if we look at the faces, then only we'll probably get an idea about how the understanding on Islam, how the Muslims are also changing in India itself. There are a large number of them who still feel that come what may, you can continue to be a true Muslim being in a liberal form or a liberal democracy like that of India, where you enjoy a lot of other freedoms which they may not get in other places of the world. That's first part of it. Second part of it, then the heart of heart, every time when there is a trigger, when there is something that is happening in some other part of the world or within India, some of the domestic issues that are happening, this is a common view that comes in saying that when perhaps we would not be suffering like this being under a democratic or a constitutional framework had we been under Sharia law, or had we been punishing some of them. So this also comes in as a strong view. Let's imagine when there is a rape, when there is a theft, or when there is a heinous crime, when it is dealt according to the Sharia law, people tend to think that it works as a deterrence. So that that brings in people, but unfortunately, these are the same group probably who don't simply realize that punishment alone is not the criterion for running a state. And for the governance model, there are many other things, and punishment is only one part of the society. Crime is one part of the society, but the larger part of the society is associated with an individual's life, individual's freedom, and individual's expression of himself free in the free and fair manner. That doesn't happen. That's exactly the problem that is associated, due to which you see people dwindling on the side of the Sharia law at times, and then they are also moving in. And given anonymity that some of these researches happen, where they say that we don't disclose, we only are interested in numbers, people tend to express depending on who is questioning them or what is the agenda behind. So I think these all work based on the propaganda, or they're trying to push some sort of a narrative saying that this is perhaps the fastest growing religion. There are different ways of administering same questionnaire in different times and different manner. I think that's exactly how it happens. So that's my concern. Other than that one, I think there is one way of looking at the problem, which is for sure it's growing in a particular fashion, which is not good for any nation state. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kishore. On behalf of the India Researchers Forum, as the chairman of this forum, I want to thank all the excellent, presentation from the distinguished scholars, the Dr. Dheeraj, the Dr. Kishore, and Professor Carnot for this, wonderful, discussion. And now my session is over. I would like to pass the floor to Mrs. Sebastian in order to go to the next panel. Mrs. Sebastian, are you in there? Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes,
okay.
sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for joining this session. Make sure you join us for the next session. Please wait.